All right, so for our ranking of arguments of God's existence, so I'm kind of just gonna. This is unscripted, so I'm kind of just gonna throw these in here. Um, so okay, so we're starting off with ontological arguments. So I'm gonna throw both of these. I'm gonna throw both of the ontological arguments together. Mm. The ontological argument is A tier, in my opinion. I do think that it does provide a lot of very solid evidence for God's existence. However, I don't think it has enough weight to essentially stand on its own 2 feet, because I don't think it necessarily proves. I don't think it necessarily proves God that He exists in a evidential way. I guess more like in a substantial way, but it does substantially prove um, his natures. Along the other one that does that is the cosmological argument. But if you are unfamiliar with the ontological argument, it is, in the simplest terms, God exists because he exists. Now that sounds stupid as fuck, right? So what does that mean, right? So basically, God is a maximally great being. So you can define God in that way, and in that sense, logic kind of proves his own existence, right? So think of it like this: God is all-knowing because him being all-knowing is greater than having limited knowledge. He is all-powerful because that is greater than having limited power. He is all-good because that is greater than having limited goodness or flawed morality. And if you push this to its limits, the logical conclusion is, well, he exists in real life because that is greater than existing as a figment of our imagination. Like I said, it's definitely a really strong argument, but I think the weakness of it is that it's because it's really complicated. There's a lot of very complicated logic chains that are involved in making the ontological argument, and if you have to be very careful about how you word it, because it is very easy to like butcher the words of the ontological argument and to appear as if you were using circular reasoning. And I think if you're an idiot, it would probably end up being circular reasoning if you are misusing it. And it's very easy for someone who doesn't really understand like logic chains and such, for them to just not really get it. It's one of the more out there arguments for God's existence, but I do think it is a very solid one. Okay, so we're going to put the banana one in F tier. So this is one that I didn't learn about until today. Might be the shittiest argument for God's existence. Because essentially it's like, oh, okay, so bananas, right? So bananas have like a wrapper on them that's like perfectly designed for humans to eat them, therefore God. It's like, I don't know, man. That's just brain rot. I haven't looked too much into it, but like, that might be the stupidest argument. That is legitimately a stupider argument than someone saying God exists because it says so in the Bible. This is a stupider argument than that. Argument for consciousness is C tier. Now the thing is with argument for consciousness is it's not a great doesn't very great job at proving God's existence, but it is good at disproving naturalism. There's a lot of other arguments on here that are way better than the consciousness argument that heavily just like throw naturalism out of the fucking water. And I'll get to that in a sec, but the argument for consciousness does not really, I mean, like, there are ways that can explain consciousness other than God. It's just that obviously God is the one that makes the most sense given all the other arguments, but like, you can be like like Hindu theology explains consciousness, and their idea of God, quote unquote, is that it's just like, you know, like if you've ever listened to like Third Eye by Tool, like it says like everything is matter is all energy condensed, and we're all human beings are one consciousness experiencing itself, right? Like that kind of shit, right? Like that explains consciousness, but that isn't really like God. That's more just like the force personified, right? I mean, you wouldn't be incorrect in calling that God, but I mean, like I said, there are other supernatural ways of explaining God, and I don't think the consciousness argument necessarily proves that. The argument from desire, is there one similar to that? Here, I'm going to use the argument for desire and the free thinking argument, both in C tier. Basically, actually, I'm going to throw them in B tier. So basically, these arguments kind of go hand in hand, because the argument for desire is essentially that, like, if God isn't real, then, like, love and emotions are just, like, fake, because they're, like, chemical reactions, like a bunch of naturalists say. And the free thinking is that, like... Actually, I'm going to put the argument for desire in C tier. Because, again, there's ways other than God that you can explain human emotions. It is good at disproving naturalism, though. Free thinking argument is better because it essentially applies that, like, without God, there is no free will. There's issues with this, but there's really good things about it. Again, really good at disproving naturalism, because there is no free will in naturalism. It's just you are a slave to your body's biochemistry. But the biggest issue with this is that this is not exactly the most biblical, considering that it's not that free will is unbiblical, but it's that humans have a very limited amount of free will, considering we are all slaves to sin. And so that kind of comes in conflict with the free will argument. But I will agree with the free will argument in the sense of, like, if Christianity is true, then you have a lot more free will than you did if naturalism is true. All right, so here's where we get to some of my favorites. So I'm going to throw a bunch of these into S tier because they're similar. Kalam cosmological argument. Aquinas' first and second ways. Is there another? And yeah, we'll throw Aquinas' third way in there. Is there another? Yeah, that's all of the that's all the cosmological argument. So the cosmological argument is extremely powerful. The cosmological argument is essentially that there needs to be an uncaused cause to essentially for the universe to exist, right? Because as of right now, there is no evidence that the universe is eternal. All the evidence that we have is that the universe has a definitive beginning point, which is the Big Bang, which, by the way, if you're unaware, the Big Bang Theory was discovered by a Catholic priest who was absolutely laughed out of science until they did the math, and they were like, holy shit, this guy's right. So props to that guy. Sorry, it was a Catholic monk, not a priest. But yeah, the whole idea is that, like, there needs to be an uncaused cause, otherwise the universe falls into infinite regress, and that is illogical. The only real argument against this is that the universe would be eternal, but, like, you know, like a lot of people, even myself included, I made this argument before, that, like, you know, the universe is kind of just expanding. So, and given the fact that the Big Bang is essentially just space, time, and matter rapidly expanding to form the universe, what if it's a cycle of just, like, the universe expanding and collapsing upon itself, and the universe is actually infinite? Yeah, but like there's not really any evidence to support that. So given what we know, it's far more logical to assume an uncaused cause rather than a eternal universe. And a lot of people would say that that's the God of the gaps fallacy, but I don't know. That's not really God of the gaps fallacy. That's kind of just logical thinking, man. Like, come on, bro. Argument from Psychophysical Harmony. Oh, by the way, before I move on, the reason I'm grouping these three along with the two ontological arguments together is because these four and these two are essentially the same thing. The Kalam cosmological argument is essentially a very simplified, modernized version of Aquinas' three ways. I'm not gonna get like super in depth, but like Aquinas's I'm a huge fan of Thomas Aquinas, but these two are by far the best two. This is talking about what I was talking about, like the uncaused cause. This is talking about the unmoved mover. That is specifically relating to Newtonian physics, right? So if you remember from your 8th grade science class, laws of Newtonian motion, objects in motion stay in motion, and objects not in motion will remain not in motion. Well, given that principle, where the fuck did motion come from? Well, it had to come from somewhere. There needs to be an unmoved mover, and we would call that God. The argument for psychophysical harmony. This is a new one that I looked up today. This one's actually fascinating. So I would say it's C tier. A lot of these arguments doesn't on its own contingently prove God. Like I would say the S tier and the A tier ones do a great job of contingently proving God. Anything else is like supplementary, right? So C tier, I would say it's C tier because it's more just about disproving naturalism. The argument of like, oh, it can't just be natural because the harmony and how we experience the physical world and how it is so like perfectly synced up to the way our mind works is definitely strong evidence. Now, there's a lot of Darwinian evolution that can explain this, but at the same time, there's a lot that science can't explain in that realm. And I do think that it supports the existence of God, but again, it doesn't prove it. Same thing with consciousness, same thing with desire. They don't really like evidently show that God exists, but it definitely provides supplementary evidence to support it. Okay, so I'm going to throw all of these together into S tier. Intrinsic value of humans, moral argument, and then where is it? Argument of moral knowledge. Right, so the morality argument, I think, is by far the strongest argument for the existence of God. This was the argument that essentially converted me to Christianity, right? So two things that are important, right? In reality, first of all, morality is either subjective or objective. Now, subjective morality or moral relativism is impossible. Why? Because under moral relativism, the value of human life is optional. And the reason why that is because if all morality is subjective, then we cannot agree on moral absolutes of murder is wrong, rape is wrong, cannibalism is wrong, etc., 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 which leads to the conclusion of human life is not inherently valued. And I would say that is a ridiculous conclusion, because I would say one of the very few self-evident truths in life is that human life is inherently valuable. Okay, so I would argue for that reason that morality cannot be subjective. Now, a lot of people will object to saying that subjective morality can be true because it's like, oh, like societies say, oh, we all collectively agree that this thing is bad. Well, that doesn't really work because there have been societies that have normalized rape and pedophilia. You look at the Roman Empire. It was very, very normal for Roman soldiers to rape little boys. I'll probably have to bleep that out for YouTube. And that was like a normal thing within Roman culture, and it was also very normal in Greek culture as well. And they were like, yeah, we don't give a shit. Like this is all cool. This is all morally okay to violate somebody, but that's not how that works. Just because a society collectively agrees on it does not mean it's true. So I would say that moral relativism cannot work. So if moral relativism cannot work, then, well, morality must be objective, right? So that essentially implies that it's not an opinion, right, that murder is wrong. It is an objective truth. It is as true to say that murder is wrong as saying 2 + 2 = 4, right? Those are of equal logical and objective truth, right? So if there is an objective moral standard, that cannot be created by human beings, right? Because human beings are subjective creatures, right? Again, if it was created by humans, then it's subjective morality, right? The opinion of whether human life has value essentially becomes like the equivalent value of like, oh, what's the greatest album of all time, right? That's not a question you can answer objectively because music is subjective, right? So there has to be a transcendental moral law that we are all measuring ourselves against, right? And where does that come from? Well, the answer is God. I would say that I have not heard a single legitimate refute for the moral argument because there is none, honestly. There is no refute to the moral argument because human beings having intrinsic value is a self-evident truth, and that kind of inherently proves that morality is objective, and objective morality needs God, right? That's how that works. What's the argument for idealism again? Let me look this up. I looked this up earlier. Oh, that's right. So the argument for idealism is essentially that, like, oh, we only experience through our mind, we only experience our consciousness. So there's no way of truly determining that, like, the physical world is real, right? It could just be like our consciousness, like, being weird or whatever. Like, we could be in the Matrix or something. So I would say that, like, the argument for it's similar to the argument for consciousness, but it's a very different angle. That in order for the physical world to be real, that there must be a God. I would say it's almost like a cross between the transcendental argument, which actually isn't on here. I would throw that in S tier if this was on here, and the consciousness argument. I would say that, like, that's like a D tier argument. Honestly, it's, again, like, I would say that all of these are, like, in the sense that, like, yeah, the arguments are true, but, like, the arguments aren't, there isn't enough evidentialness or logic to prove, like, all of them. So it's all about how much that they get there. I would say that the argument for idealism does not get there. Same thing with the argument for fine-tuning. I used to think the fine-tuning argument was really good until I kind of heard, like, the puddle theory. The fine-tuning argument is essentially just like, oh, like, if the physical constraints of the universe within the laws of physics, like the gravitational force, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, or the electron charge, were like a hair of a percentile different, then the universe would just completely collapse upon itself. And, like, sure, it definitely presents evidence, but, like, the argument against that is, like, the puddle argument, which is like, oh, if there's, like, a hole in the sidewalk and then a bunch of rainwater filled up the puddle so that it perfectly, the amount of rainwater within that hole perfectly fits the hole, you wouldn't say that that hole was perfectly designed for that puddle. The puddle just grew to match the hole. And that's kind of the argument, that kind of destroys the fine-tuning argument, because, like, you know, like, that's kind of how the universe worked. I definitely think that I definitely do agree that the universe was fine-tuned, but I don't think that the fine-tuning argument inherently shows that. Evolutionary argument against naturalism. This is a really good one. While it is one of my personal favorites, I'm going to put it in B tier. Again, this is a really great argument against naturalism, but it doesn't necessarily show God. But it can lead to that conclusion, right? So, obviously, I've been an evolutionist all my life. Which, side note, creationism is retarded. Basically, one of the theories that naturalism hinges on is that life came from non-life, right? The theory of abiogenesis, that in the primordial Earth, all of like the conditions, like the heat and like the salt temperatures and like whatever, allowed for like proteins and DNA and stuff to form on its own. And I kind of was looking into abiogenesis before converting, and I realized that there was a lot of holes in abiogenesis, right? And I definitely think that that is a huge, huge reason why naturalism is absolutely just does not work, because abiogenesis is, it's like, you know, all the creationists will just say, oh, it's just a theory when talking about evolution. Well, that's kind of what abiogenesis is. It is just a theory. It has never actually been proven. There is so many holes in it, right? I'm not saying that there's no way that abiogenesis could be true, but it is very unlikely in my opinion, right? I'm not disputing the existence of evolutionists, by the way. I just said that creationism is stupid. Like, I affirm 1000% theistic evolution, right? The only difference between theistic evolution and Darwinian evolution is simply that the cause of evolution is God and not just that it was random, right? That is the difference between the two, right? And so the idea of theistic evolution is an amazing argument against naturalism. And I would say that that's like that, and the moral argument kind of just actually, honestly, all of these arguments just kind of low-key just destroy naturalism. And that's, by the way, why naturalism is such a shit theology, because every single argument for God's existence low-key just demolishes it, right? But I would say, in terms of proving God, theistic evolution is fine. It's fine. The contingency argument is low-key. The contingency argument low-key sucks, because the contingency argument kind of presupposes that the universe is more contingent than people actually think it is. If you really look into it, the universe is very chaotic, and it's very uncontingent. At times it can be very contingent, but I don't think it always is, and so for that reason, I would say that it's not a great argument, because first of all, it doesn't show God, right? It definitely could, given the framework of the rest of the arguments, support the existence of God, but that doesn't make it a good argument in and of itself. That just means that it can be supplementary, and I would say that it's a mid at best supplementary argument. Yeah, just because people presuppose the contingency of the universe. This is one that I need to look in more to, but the math argument. The Redeem Zoomer, one of my favorite YouTubers, made a very long. Actually, it's not that long. It's like 5 minutes long. Go watch that video. Go watch the Redeem Zoomer's argument that math proves God. He uses what is called the Mandelbrot set, which is this like crazy complicated geometric pattern that the more you zoom in on it, it gains infinite complexity, and it exists nowhere in the universe, right? And there's a lot of other math-related arguments that prove God, but it is a very Platonist argument. If you're unaware, Plato, the Greek philosopher, essentially argued that ideas essentially exist in a metaphysical sense, right? And I would agree with him. That goes more into the transcendental argument, which I can talk about in a sec. But yeah, that math. The argument is, other than like the Mandelbrot set, is essentially that math gets more and more complicated, and gets more and more disconnected from this world, but it still functionally works, right? So the fact that there are numbers that do not correlate to real life things, but still functionally work within math, definitely supports the existence for God, and it is definitely a great argument. The laws of nature argument. This is a not great. This is actually a good argument. This is a little bit similar to the cosmological argument and the moral argument in the sense of where like the laws of physics exist because of God, right? If they're right, like the fact that there is definitive laws of nature that reality is constricted to. Like you can't just break the laws of physics. That's not how that fucking works, right? So the fact that there are definitive laws of physics that cannot be broken points to God, right? Because it points to the fact that the universe was designed. Again, I don't think that I think this is more of a suppositional, a supplementary argument rather than a primary argument. I would say anything in A tier or S tier is a primary argument that you can use to prove God's existence. Everything else is either separate, is supplementary, or just bad. F tier is just bad. Which, by the way, I'm throwing personal experience in there. Personal experience is great for convincing oneself that God is real. I would say that you can talk to any Christian and they have personal experience for God. I have personal experience for God. My friends have personal experience of God. And it's great for convincing yourself that God is real and less of like, oh, I have faith, more of like, I know this to be true, right? But that's not good at convincing other people, right? The watchmaker argument. This is essentially the teleological argument. I don't think it's a great argument, which it kind of relies on explaining things within the physical world to prove God. Essentially, that like, oh, many things within. If you found like an engine lying around, you would say like, oh yeah, this was made by an engine maker, right? For that same reason, like things within the universe, like organisms and like planets and such and such and such function similar to machines. So there must be like a machinist or a designer, or in this case the Pauli, is it Paley or Pally argument that he made, that there must be a watchmaker because things in the universe is like a watch. It's a bunch of moving parts that all intersect with each other and stuff. And that proves God. It definitely supports the existence of. Actually, I'm going to move this up to C tier. Definitely supports the existence of God, but the problem is that it kind of says like, oh, complex thing in the universe equals God, which that doesn't exactly work because, well, we only know of our one universe, so that we don't really have anything to compare it to. So we don't know actually that thing is complicated, that our universe is complicated. So on that basis, the teleological argument is not great, and also God is inherently a metaphysical being, and so I think that when you start moving into using physical to define the metaphysical, I would say that kind of borders on the God of the gaps fallacy. So I think the best arguments for God's existence stay strictly in the metaphysical realm, right? And that's with these A tier and S tier arguments. The cosmological argument is strictly a metaphysical argument. Math argument is strictly a metaphysical argument. Ontological argument is, I would say it's more of a logical argument than a metaphysical argument. And the moral argument is both a metaphysical and a logical argument, right? The Descartes trademark argument is D tier. It is definitely a very interesting thought experiment, but I don't think it very evidently showed God. Basically, Descartes was like, oh, so like my need for God to exist proves God because it's like it is like a carpenter inscribing his signature or whatever to show that as a mark of his craft. And I would say that like, yeah, cool, like he's definitely right? Like I definitely agree with that sentiment, but it's like that logic in and of itself doesn't really show God, right? And if you use that argument for a non-believer, that's a shitty argument because they're saying like, oh well, I don't have that, so like that means God isn't real because he didn't leave his mark on me. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't know. It's not a great argument. I definitely agree with the thought process, and I think it's a very interesting line of thought, but it's not very, I wouldn't say it's very functional. And the last one that is not on the list that I am going to talk about is the transcendental argument, which would go straight into S tier. The transcendental argument is essentially that like the physical world and how we explain it is contingent on things that are transcendent and that we kind of suppose exist, right? Like we presuppose that logic will always function consistently. We presuppose that math always functions the way it does, right? And we presuppose that like scientific law always functions the way that it does, right? So now that in of itself makes perfect sense if there is a God that can essentially create these transcendental factors, right? Because logic is inherently metaphysical. Math is inherently metaphysical, right? Anybody who says that metaphysical things are not real is a dumbass, because that means they're denying and they're saying, oh, God's real. God's not real because anything metaphysical is real. That's a shitty argument because math is inherently metaphysical, right? So, and that's why I said the math argument ties into the transcendental argument, right? Math is inherently metaphysical, right? So these metaphysical concepts like logic and math and science are contingent upon we cannot presuppose that they exist. Oh, and the other one, objective truth. We cannot presuppose that these things exist without God, right? Because if there is transcendent metaphysical concepts, then they have to come from somewhere, right? If like, because like, you know, math, there's a lot of postmodernists that argue that 2 + 2 = 5 because math is an invented system, and they oppose the idea of like an objective truth or whatever, right? If you went back before humans ever existed and you put two rocks together, if you found two groups of two rocks and then put them together in a pile, it's still gonna mean 4, right? So that means that 2 + 2 = 4 is a logically true statement that is applicable for literally all of time. It is a transcendental, eternal truth, right? And that points to a transcendental and eternal creator, because that didn't just come from nowhere, right? Like, and the thing is that's why we need God, because we cannot presuppose the existence of those things without God, because without God you cannot prove that those things exist, right? So that's why I would say that there's an S tier argument. I would say that S tier arguments, there is a legitimate non-answer besides these arguments. There is legitimately no answer for the cosmological argument unless we prove that the universe is actually eternal. I don't think we will, simply because I believe in God. The moral argument, I've legitimately never heard an actually good argument against why morality is subjective or why human beings can create subjective morality. Spoiler alert, there is no answer. The answer is God is real and he created objective morality. And the transcendental argument is also kind of the same thing of like, yeah, like there's no refute against those big three arguments. And these ones, the ontological argument and the math argument, are a little more complicated. They're a little more out there, and they're very easy to misunderstand and just not get it. Right. So for that reason, they're in A tier. And then all of these are like supplementary. You would not use anything from B to D tier as a primary argument for God's existence. These are to essentially be secondary to these. These are your primary methods of proving God's existence, and this is essentially how you show these to be evident, because these are logic and metaphysical based. A lot of these are based in physics, or essentially are just disproving naturalism, right? And yeah, never use these, right? Like, sure, you can use personal experience to convince yourself God is real. If I ever catch someone using the banana argument, I'm genuinely slapping the shit out of them. And these are just dumb arguments, right? These are just like low IQ brain rot arguments for God's existence. So don't use them, please. And yeah, that is the conclusion of the ranking.